Hello, world, and hello, wonderful listeners. I am so excited to be back. And actually, this is a little bit of a twist from the rest of the series. I have the first ever Conscious Curiosity guest. I have typically had a sort of a long running season co-host, and I've loved it, both with Matt and with Liz. And I want to make each season sort of more interesting and more curious and a bit different from the last. So I'm really, really excited to welcome Nat Hawley. Welcome, Nat.
Hi, Frank. Honestly, pleasure to be here. Can't wait to be your first guest.
Likewise. I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but I've been excited ever since we sort of agreed to put this in. So to our wonderful listeners, if you haven't heard of Nat yet, where have you been? Nat is the founder of Divergent Thinking, a neurodiversity strategist and inclusive design consultant. Autistic, dyslexic, and dyspraxic. He blends lived insight with evidence to build workshops and workplaces where neurodivergent talent isn't just accommodated, but actually expected to excel. Nat has led hundreds of workshops and supported thousands of neurodivergent professionals, partnering with hundreds of organizations along the way. A Pride of Britain nominee, commended by His Royal Highness King Charles. He's a TEDx speaker, featured by BBC News and Forbes. He helps teams strip bias from hiring and promotion, simplify their leadership with behavioral science, and co-create policy, AI workflows, and assistive tech. He describes his style as high energy, engaging, and a strengths-based approach. Wow, what a CV. Nah, took me about 10 minutes just to read it. So I was saying off camera, like, what a CV, what a background, and welcome.
Well, honestly, it always feels good to do that. I'm normally doing the opposite for other people, so it's nice to hear it back. But yeah, I mean, that's a condensed amount. I've been doing everything related to neurodiversity for about 8 years now. So it truly is my passion. Originally, it was just something that I wanted to understand my own mind a bit more. And the more I learned about it, the more I started talking about it and then realizing there's a lot of other people who resonate and are quite confused. So it just kind of grew from there, really. And it definitely wasn't something that I planned to do, just kind of fell into it because I enjoyed talking about it.
And it really, really shows. It was actually your TEDx talk, and we'll put a link to the TEDx talk in the show notes, of course. But it was that made me sort of get in touch with you in the first place, and we sort of chatted. And certainly, I felt like, wow, we have a lot in common. Not just our work in neurodiversity. You've got the same neuroscience degree that I'm working on at the moment, so lots of sort of synergies there, and lots of exciting stuff. And so today we're sort of loosely going to talk about a paper you suggested, an article you suggested from the Harvard Business Review's 2017 article called Neurodiversity as a Competitive Advantage, Why You Should Embrace It in Your Workforce. So I'm going to loosely reference that a few times, but would love to hear your thoughts along the way. And I'd be curious, just to kick us off, what your experience of neurodiversity in the workplace is, perhaps professionally now, but also previously.
Well, I do think you can't really talk about neurodiversity in the workplace without talking about neurodiversity in the education system. So I do think that kind of sets everything up. I mean, when you're younger, everyone always says like, oh, what do you want to be when you grow up? And one, that's a really difficult question to answer. But also, if you are neurodivergent, there are these kind of invisible barriers for you. I thought I wanted to do science, but I wasn't very good at the grading system. So like I knew my stuff, but I wasn't good at passing exams. So I had to go down a bit of a different route. And long story short, I went into the media because I like storytelling and it was something that I knew I could pass in. And when I was working in the media at the start of my career, honestly, it was really challenging because there were no amendments. There was no kind of understanding. And I started doing lots of kind of social action groups, support networks in order to support neurodivergent people. And I think through doing that is where I kind of found my passion and kind of mixed things up a little bit and took it in a different direction. But honestly, I'd say more often than not, I think people are genuinely very supportive of different ways of thinking, but they aren't very good at knowing what to do. And they make a lot of mistakes along the way, which do have kind of negative consequences and can kind of affect your self-esteem in the long run. So yeah, it's been a bit up and down on the whole, but I have noticed an improvement with organizations on the whole. Or maybe I should say I've noticed an improvement with managers, individual managers, opposed to whole entire organizations.
Wow. Yeah, there's so much there as I desperately trying not to interject and jump in, which I'm sometimes prone to do. Yeah, I think the link there with the education system is a really important one. Like you, I'm dyspraxic, and it was actually I found out about the dyspraxia a decade before I found out about the ADHD in my case. And it was basically, I was really overwhelmed with exams. I had just sort of bad luck, I guess. My specific modules at my specific uni in my specific year were sort of lined up. So I think I had sort of three-hour exams that were supposed to all be in one day. So you're supposed to doing 9 hours of exams. Plus, I'd just only been diagnosed with dyspraxia, essentially as a result of the stress of planning for this. And so when you factor in extra time, it was something like you did for 10, 11, 12 hours a day. And that was obviously not going to be possible, right? And it was also something like 70% of my entire year. So it was just really unfortunate sort of scheduling, whatever. But everything you just said there really resonated at a personal level, right? This idea of the education system and it certainly ties into my own experience. And the point you made there around actually, you're seeing more and more people who are well-intentioned, and perhaps people aren't quite sure how to act or don't quite know where to take things. But I'm curious, you mentioned, you've been doing this for 8 years or so, and I'd be curious to see from your perspective how you think things have changed in that time.
Oh, there's been tremendous growth in the last 8 years. When I first started, neurodiversity as a term wasn't really a thing. Now, we know it's been around since the 90s, but terms take a while to kind of grow and build momentum. When I was first interested, all I knew it was, I have a lot of conditions and disorders. And it was something I was curious to learn more about, but it definitely wasn't out of a kind of empowerment stance. And when I started initially working in the sector and thinking, all right, well, originally I worked in a lot of charities, and charities are great because you think, all right, you've got a lot of people who want to do good in the world, but then you have to question and ask yourself, am I a charity? Do I want this to be seen as a charitable thing? Is this a nice to have? Is this something people do to kind of mark off their corporate social responsibility? And that isn't really how I wanted to see it. When I found out about the term neurodiversity, it was honestly a massive light bulb moment. It's diversity of thought, appreciating that we are neither great nor terrible. It is somewhat of a neutral term that we can choose to make a strength if we understand it better. So from my understanding, I was terrible at spelling. I was socially awkward in situations. I was a bit kind of quirky and, quite frankly, a little bit odd. But when I understood neurodiversity, it was understanding that, yes, there are, and they are the deficits or disorders as what we've been called our entire life, but equally there are the strengths and skills that you really thrive in. I was a great communicator, a storyteller. I was good at innovation, very entrepreneurial. And I think that really empowered me to think, well, is this just a marketing ploy to kind of rebrand the word disability to make people like me and you feel better about ourselves? Or is there actual evidence to back this up? And then through doing lots of research, you realize there is evidence. These strengths aren't just, a new coat of paint. They really do exist. So if I'm going to organizations and say, hey, you need to support neurodivergent individuals, are they doing it because they are doing it because it's a nice thing to do? And if so, that just re-feeds into like the traditional medical model that, oh, bless them, let's help them. Or are they doing it because they appreciate and value the strengths, but equally they need the strengths? And I think that's why I decided to move into the social enterprise model where, hey, this ain't a freebie here. You want our talent, you need to work for it. And that's kind of grew from that standpoint, really. So at the beginning, I made a very clear, conscious effort that I wasn't going to do charity. I was going to be a service which people would pay into if they saw the value. The next challenge was, well, how do I get people to see the value in it? I wasn't just, for instance, selling a service. I was selling a concept that they had never heard of. So honestly, I remember for the first 6 months, I literally went door knocking. before the pandemic. I was like going on all the like doors in the offices, having meeting after meeting after meeting. And I was making a lot of friends. People loved talking to me, but no one wanted to put their money where their mouth was because it was just such an untangible thing. Now, it took 6 months before I even kind of made like my first, I don't really like the word sell in this sense, but a kind of a partnership. Oh, things have completely shifted. People know what neurodiversity is now, or at least they know the basic premise of it. People will come to me say, our organization is actively looking to be neuro-inclusive. So yeah, I would say on one hand, the job's easier now, but on the other hand, it's more challenging because before you could teach people from the very beginning, but now people have learned a lot of kind of like neuro myths, bad habits along the way. So yeah, it's changed. And also the work we do is becoming more and more oversaturated, which is great in one way because there's more than enough neurodivergent people that need support. But on the other hand, it does make it kind of harder to kind of sustain a living out of this. So yeah, it's been a roller coaster, but I'm excited to see where it continues to progress.
Yeah, well, I'm excited for you. And again, I think one of the things that, drew me to you and the sort of conversations that we've had is we're in this neurodiversity space. We both really care about what we do. Lots of overlap, but equally different sort of starting points, right? You come from the sort of consultant strategist point of view. I come from the coaching perspective, but slightly nuanced in terms of what we do. Coaching is very much about sort of helping people unlock their own solutions or, explore. And I love working with you. Working with teams in that capacity and stuff like that. I'd love to work with you, actually. Now I think about it.
That's nice.
And I know your role is quite sort of practical, quite hands-on in the same way, but equally in a different way. And it's really interesting to hear you describe that evolution and actually the recognition that, it's a service that's worth paying for. I think I'm very much in that camp as well. And one is that, fundamentally, things like exposure don't make the world go round, unfortunately. But two, I used to work for a business called Innocent Drinks, like this, all the smoothies. You've probably heard of them, right? And the reason I mention them is because, they're a for-profit business. They've got to make money. Yeah. But actually, one of their big things is they give 10% of profits to charity. And they do great work redistributing that to some awesome causes. Like fundamentally, they need to make money for that to be the case, right? They need to redistribute. Yeah. And I'm okay with that. Like, I know people sometimes criticize charities or the likes of you and I for charging and so on. But firstly, one is you're paying for an expertise, right? That, you've got degrees and years of experience and thousands of hours of delivery that people are paying for, right? They're not paying for the 3 hours, they're paying for your thousands of hours of experience, right? And in much the same way as that Innocent Drinks example is like, you've got to be sort of taken care of in order to take care of others. When business is doing well for me, I tend to give out more free hours of coaching or discounted hours. I call it my scholarship rate, essentially, where, if I'm sort of taken care of and I got the needs met, then I can afford to work with more people on a sort of pay what you can basis. And every business will have a different approach to that. But coming to this paper, then there's a few things, and it's interesting. Again, it's sort of called Neurodiversity as a Competitive Advantage. And I've read this paper a few times over the years and referred to it in different, blogs and videos and what have you. I was only really recently reading it again. I was like, actually, I like this article less and less, but I'd be curious to sort of kick it around with you. So essentially, they talk a lot about in the article about sort of different schemes. So certain companies like EY, Ford, Dell, SAP, Microsoft, sort of doing some quite high profile, should we say, neurodiversity, neuroinclusion sort of practices. And, they talk about the statistics of autism in the US, for example. They said 1 in 42 among boys and 1 in 189 among girls. I think the statistic I remember reading was, 0.5% of women and 1.5% of men. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Nat.
It varies depending on who you ask.
Yeah, and of course the metric used, and exactly it varies. But I guess the point there is that, if ADHD is 5 to 7% of the population, then autism is perhaps, it's a lower prevalence, but also perhaps lower in discussion or less discussed is what I really mean. Is that a fair comment, do you think? Or am I overgeneralizing?
I don't know. I would say that autism is discussed quite heavily, but it's ones that like, I don't know, dyspraxia or dyslexia, which don't get as much airtime in terms of the support that's available. I think there's somewhat like a hierarchy when it comes to neurodivergent conditions of what is considered kind of needing more support and less support. And while we refer to them as like hidden disabilities for some people, they're also not hidden, or at least dyslexia and ADHD are very visible. And dyslexia and dyspraxia can kind of go under the under like the veil. So yeah, I think it kind of does vary, but also you might have more people who have, I know, say dyspraxia, but their needs are more individual, so they affect them internally, where autism or ADHD, they also impact people externally because they don't really know how to interact. So while there may be technically less of them, they are much more noticeable in day-to-day life.
Yeah. And it's a really interesting point you said there around, neurodiversity as this sort of umbrella term. And I think ADHD and autism probably get the sort of headline in discussions. As part, we're both dyspraxic, and I rarely hear dyspraxia mentioned. In fact, I quite often when I'm doing sessions get asked, what is dyspraxia or dyscalculia or whatever it be. And so that's sort of much more common a question than perhaps I was expecting when I started, started out on this. And of course, we know about the common overlaps in terms of our conditions. Some we may not even know about yet, right? Like I said, my case was sort of a decade between the two. It's interesting, again, reading the paper. On one hand, I was like, yeah, this is great. This is a really like pro neurodiversity paper. Why you should embrace it in your workforce. On the other hand, I thought there were elements of it which were really clumsy. So I'm going to read them out to you, and I'd be curious.
Oh, no, please do. And I like the fact that you mentioned you didn't like it. I just want to say why I selected it. Not because I necessarily agree with it, but just because it was one of the first kind of papers I remember reading back in 2017, like when it originally came out. So I found it very influential at the time, but it is interesting reading it with a 2025 lens.
Yeah, absolutely.
What holds up today?
I think a really important point, right? Like the two authors, would they write the same article today? Who knows? I don't know. I've never met them, but yeah. And actually that's the whole point of this podcast is we're not always going to agree on stuff, and that's okay. And some things might go out of date. And I think I've said a few times, I'm a bit nervous of getting cancelled, but launching a podcast is probably not the right thing to do if that's the case. But
I mean, I always fall back on my autism, to be honest, when I do that. Like I struggle with having a filter, which is a blessing and a curse. And I think you just got to embrace it. And neurodiversity is something which is the term at least, is very much in flux. So what people knew 10 years ago will be different to what people talk about in 10 years. I'm certain we are saying things which will be considered politically incorrect. And that's okay, as long as the intent is there. And that's how I kind of go about things. I don't mind people saying things that are somewhat offensive, long as they had the correct intent, and then we can have a discussion and we can talk about it.
It's a really interesting point you make there, and I could spend another podcast just talking about this. Right? I remember talking to my coaching supervisor, and as a coach, I perhaps have conversations with clients, perhaps in a way that you don't. And what I mean by that is sometimes with your one-to-one client, things go wrong, or perhaps you upset them, they upset you. One of you is dysregulated for whatever reason, and it's uncomfortable, right? There's all sorts of boundaries we've got to draw and that sort of stuff. But I remember my supervisor saying, like, your job isn't to be popular. Your job is to, be the coach that they've essentially brought you in for. Your experience has brought you to the table, and stand by that. And I think back to some of the conversations I've had where I've accidentally said something that's upset a client or whatever it might be. And I'm like you, I've sort of come to peace with the idea that some of the things I might say don't come off the way I intend, and I've just got to accept it, right? And it's well intended. And as you say, I think that's the main thing is, And I, as a slight aside as well, there's the comedian Jack Whitehall, he says, if I'm ever cancelled, it will be for something I've already done or already said. And I think there's an element of that too. It's like, okay, well, whatever's been said has been said. And so I just sort of make peace with that.
There are many comedians that I love. Like, I often find a lot of neurodivergent people have incredibly dark sense of humors. And, there's many reasons why that could be, but there's so many comedians that do not get cancelled. And because it's about their intent.
Yeah.
And, for instance, they might be using something to highlight a point. I have so many people, like all my friends will say, like, I don't know how you can get away with saying these things. If I said it, it would not fly. But because there's like, I don't know, a sense of kind of innocence, cheekiness, well-intention behind it, people don't take it so seriously.
Yeah.
So, I've done many talks where I have just said what was on my mind. And even though for most people they'll be terrified, I kind of get away with it.
Yeah.
So I think intent is always the most important. I often compare it to the equivalent where I may be a specialist in neurodiversity, but I'm not a specialist when it comes to sex and gender. So with all the different kind of pronouns and the different words, I'm incredibly clumsy with them. I try. So when I get it wrong, there's not like kind of pitchforks kind of ready to like dismantle me. People will calmly say, oh, Nat, this is the correct way. And because they came at it from a respectful perspective, I'm never offended. So, I often get people say things like using the term neurodiverse, neurodivergent wrong, or, say Asperger's, or people say, oh, I suffer. And I'm very aware that those are terms or ways of looking at it which don't align with my views. But what I will say is I understand why you may have used that word through these historical reasons. People typically don't use that word anymore. This is the context. So I guess really it's about explaining connotations to people about what they're saying and how it can mean to others. And if they still choose to use it, well, so be it. But at least they are informed about what it might mean to other people.
Yeah, there's definitely a piece there around sort of personal preference and choice, and as you say, just sort of explaining it as well. And so on that note, it was really interesting sort of putting out a few quotes from this article. There's one.
Go for it.
There's one that says neurodiverse people frequently need workplace accommodations. Sometimes they exhibit challenging eccentricities, and I sort of highlighted them in red, being like, oh, don't like it. But again, I think to your point, in 2017. This was probably a fairly forward-looking, quite progressive article. So I'll sort of let them off the idea of, that they exhibit challenging eccentricities or that frequently need workplace accommodations. I think what he's saying is, sometimes people might need workplace accommodations, but I think it was sort of the extremity of the language that I wanted to call out.
I find it aligns quite closely to what I was saying about when I first started off with trying to get organizations on board, that you have got to sell a concept to them first. And the nearest equivalent that they may know about is the traditional medical model of seeing things as purely deficits. So I do think when they were talking about these things, if you compare it to the traditional medical model of how we see disability, is a very progressive way of talking about difference. But when we compare it to our current understanding of things not being neither good nor bad, or the fact that the challenges aren't inherently due to me, but it's due to the lack of adjustments that society brings, then it does look incredibly outdated and clunky.
Yeah, and there's almost always going to be two sides to every story, right? And then so I'm not here to bash any particular article, far from it. I think there's a lot in it, and actually, they talk about how actually different organizations saw, I think 30% more productivity in the sort of neurodiverse teams than in less diverse teams. I'm always wary of over selling this productivity advantage because I don't want to go too far down the sort of superhero thing.
No, I really dislike that a lot.
Yeah.
I try to think, I'm not like an X-Man. Like, I don't have any kind of like secret abilities. I wish I did. Of course, there's amazing examples where you think, I know Stephen Wiltshire, who kind of like went over London, saw it, and was able to draw it off by heart. And while we all do have abilities, it could take a lifetime to discover exactly what they are. And that's why I like to say, while I do come from a strength-based approach, the only reason I do that is that we have spent hundreds and hundreds of years of talking about how terrible it is to be different. So it's just more kind of balancing the discussion. But eventually, I think that balance will level out and we can acknowledge the challenges, which may not inherently be due to the person, but just due to the world we live in. But regardless of where the challenges come from, they still exist. But equally, we can acknowledge the strengths. So the way I always word it is that these strengths, if you want them, you have to put adjustments in place. And it's like a stepping stone. So for the people who really struggle, there aren't adjustments. For the people who really thrive, there are adjustments. But quite often what happens is that we have to create our own adjustments. And that often kind of translates to starting up our own business and going freelance. So I think organizations are getting there, but they're still too binary in how they see adjustments. We love automating. So for instance, can I have a checklist of how to support people? Doesn't work like that. And when we talk about, dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, of course they have to be part of the discussion. But if you to ask me honestly where I think it's heading, I actually think these labels will be abandoned at some point. I don't know when, maybe like, I don't know, the DSM-6 or the ICD-12, probably a little bit later. But these labels are ultimately, in my opinion, quite arbitrary. They are fantastic starting points in order to have a conversation, but they don't really tell you anything about the individual. They don't take individuality into consideration, intersectionality. There's no genetic elements to it whatsoever. So, in the future, would I still be diagnosed with dyspraxia or dyslexia or autism? Honestly, I don't think I might be. Yeah. But regardless of what I'm diagnosed with, I'll still probably have the same barriers and challenges that I face every day in society. And I'm equally still going to have the same strengths that I have day to day.
Yeah. So again, so much that we could go on in like 1,000 different threads. And
that's just my opinion. And it's not to discredit anyone else's, because I appreciate people spend it like years and years trying to gain the right and the privilege to have a label. But I would gain really push back on people is like, if, for instance, school systems and workplaces was truly inclusive and adjustments were given on a one-to-one basis, would these labels particularly be of value? Maybe as a very, very headline, like, hey, let's start a conversation that is broadly related to these traits. But ultimately, I think they probably wouldn't serve much value in a more utopian world.
So much I wanted to pick up on, and I have to rack my brains to think about which points I want to touch on. One around, you mentioned DSM-5 and ICD-11, or the DSM and ICD. Those are I don't know. Those are sort of two of the big diagnostic frameworks, depending on where you are in the world, against which sort of criterias are, for want of a better phrase, sort of ticked off or met, and to help a diagnostician sort of diagnose someone, whether they're ADHD or any number of different conditions. And they come under a lot of fire because of exactly your point there, just how sort of black and white they are. They can be quite subjective. The idea of, are they really valid? Internationally, they were largely built with sort of white men like us in mind, and lots of flaws to those systems. And a module that we've both done, I did an essay, and I don't know if you did the same one, but I did an essay on exactly this topic. It was basically like, there are clearly flaws in these diagnostic frameworks. What are the solutions? And some of the proposals around that are really interesting, somewhat in line with what you're saying there around, do you remove labels altogether and put people on a sort of scale? Of course, the word spectrum is often associated with autism, and there's one sort of alternative framework called RDOC, Research Domain Criteria, I think it was. And they sort of suggest a more sort of a scale. The challenge with that then is you inevitably end up on there still with having some sort of label depending on where you end up on the scale. So really, really curious to see where, like you've just said, I'm really curious to see where that goes. And I think we're both really fascinated by this sort of intersection between the medical model, which is very deficit-led, and that social model, the idea that society is and isn't set up to support everyone.
I'm also curious to know your perspective on that, to be honest. Like, if you were to recreate the system from scratch, would you use labels? Would you not use labels? I try and think things need names. Without names, can't talk about anything.
Right.
So I'm not like, throw the baby out with the bathwater. History has gotten us to this point, and it's about taking what we've learned and evolving it. So I'm not against labels completely. I just honestly don't think they were intended for everyday folks. I think they were created for professionals. And let's face it, if you are struggling with a neurodivergent trait, you go to the doctor. If you are struggling with back pain, you go to the doctor. You go to the doctor when something isn't working the way you want it to work. So there is nothing wrong in that scenario with it being deficit focused, because in that scenario, it is a deficit. But in day-to-day life, when you're just living going around, it's not a deficit. It's just is. And that is kind of where I think we need the new terms to originate from. So not disregarding the medical model, because it's perfect for the medical environment, but not perfect, but it is fit for purpose-ish for that environment. But what do we do for everyday folk? Like, I wouldn't want to go to my employer and tell them I have dyspraxia. Why? Because dyspraxia inherently and will always be a deficit label. And even though I can educate them to know we don't really mean that anymore, it means something different, but it's got the same name. And that's why I always preferred the term neurodivergent. But equally, in itself, it becomes too binary, neurotypical, neurodivergent.
These are my feelings too. Yeah, I absolutely. I've just realized it wasn't RDOC I was talking about. That's on the scale. It's another model called high top, but let's not get stuck into that. I completely agree. Like, on one hand, like if I've broken my ankle or twisted my ankle, like that's a label in itself, right? That the doctor needs to know to then prescribe some sort of support, right? And
you wouldn't expect them to balance it out with a strength-based approach. Like, your ankle's broke, however, what a lovely shape. You don't need a balance in everything.
Yeah, I'm sure if we were to have 1, 2, 3, 4 more people on, sort of discussing this with us, I'm sure we'd get 1, 2, 3, 4 more different opinions, right? So
I completely agree. Yeah. I've had many talks to people where they completely disagree with my perspective, and that's fine. I think that, again, going back to like how these guides and manuals are created, they are really flawed, and it'd be really hard to scrap it or kind of get rid of it. I mean, the way I see it going ultimately is that it's, rather than being more psychiatry, so I observe there being differences in you, so I'll give you this label in order to help you navigate things that would benefit you, it will go down to more neuroscience, so for instance, maybe you can do an MRI and go boop, 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 over your head, and they're like, all right, well, you've got autism, you don't have autism. Now, on one hand, that's much more definitive. And rather than just saying autism, it would be more tailored support. So this is exactly how your brain works. This is exactly how it would support you. But equally, that could open a whole can of worms where there's a lot of people who today resonate with having X, Y, Z, and they get support for it. But if you had a neuroscience perspective where some AI could say, no, you don't have this, then you no longer get support. So in many ways, the future, while it opens up to a more inclusive and much more tailored way of gaining support, it also excludes a lot of people. And then it becomes more of rather than an individual personality traits, it's like you either have or you do not have. So I don't know. That's why I'm not overly excited for the future in that regard, because I think we progress in some ways, but equally we might go back in some ways.
Yeah, and how do I put this non-controversially? I do think there is an element to which you look at any sort of symptoms list and you may identify or not identify, and then those sort of traits might become sort of self-reinforcing. I know I work with quite a lot of clients that have, like us, multiple conditions, multiple labels, and they might identify with one more than the other, right? They might go, I've had a client say to me, I'm not that autistic. Tell me about ADHD. And
one sounds more interesting and favorable. We all have preferences. the example I always give to people is when I was younger, my mum would always get these like TV magazines on what would be on the TV. And as soon as we got them, I flipped to the back and it'd be the horoscopes. And I'd always read the horoscopes. And me being me, I didn't know what month meant what. So for years and years, I thought I was one horoscope, I don't know, like a label or whatever they're called. And I was like, this is 100% me. I was convinced. And it wasn't until I got a bit older, I checked the dates and I was completely off.
Right.
And then I started reading all of them and I connected with every single one of them. And that's the thing that really kind of made me think about all these labels is that when I was younger, I didn't even know I had dyspraxia because no one really knew how to explain it to me. So I didn't connect with it. This is, what I kind of think a bit like Oppenheimer or like someone who like was trying to create something good, but ultimately created something probably absolutely terrible. I kind of felt like that in my old position. I created a range of characteristic quizzes to help people identify neurodivergent traits. I had the world's best intentions because I thought getting diagnosed is expensive. The process is horrifically complex. People don't want to be going and paying out that money if they do not have something. So let me take all of these official academic materials and condense them down to like do you have this? Do you have this? You are this likely to have X, Y, Z. However, it was a terrible idea. It's been ridiculously popular. Like we had like millions of people using it. I absolutely hate it. And the reason is because it's too simplistic. You know, if depending on how you ask the question, what you ask, what you omit, what you don't omit, people will resonate with everything you say. Like when people go looking for these online quizzes, they're already in a place where they are struggling and they do not have someone to say, well, is this how you feel for over 12 months or more? When you're in that moment, you can't really think about that. It's a bit like kind of going shopping on a hungry stomach. You know, it's really difficult to think about what you actually need opposed to what you need right in this moment.
Yeah, and that one in particular, there'll be lots of arguments on both sides, right? Lots of people will say, well, diagnosis isn't for everyone. It also isn't available for everyone. That's the conversation for another day. Yeah, there's so much in here we could unpack, right? And something you just said just reminded me. I remember speaking to Professor Amanda Kirby, who is a big name in this space. So sort of every time I see her, I'm sort of just like sort of in awe, right? And I remember speaking to her, and I think I asked her, where do you see us in sort of 5-10 years time? And she said, well, I think in the long run, people won't have as many sort of discrete like buckets essentially that they fall into, the quote unquote labels. Instead, it will be, we've all got a profile and certain traits on that profile. It will be less about the one sort of headline label and more about the traits on your profile, i.e. that more sort of like spectrum or scale approach. And yeah, it will be really interesting to see, how things pan out, how neurodiversity slots into so many other initiatives and so many other conversations. To touch on, I guess, a couple of things from the article and from our different sort of lines of work. They talk about support circles. I guess in the UK, we might call them something like an ERG group, an employee resource group. Here in the article, they suggest one for the workplace, one for personal life. I've seen them close up. I've done a bit of work with a few of them, and I tend to see them as being fairly positive. I think they're pretty much always well-intentioned. What's your experience with like ERG groups and how do you approach that in your line of work?
Oh, well, I mean, I work with ERG groups, employee resource groups all the time. I've set up many of them. I work with a lot of them who are having difficulties maintaining them. So I guess just for everyone's clear, HR, great in everything. However, there is a bias. They want to be seen as doing well. So having, say, initiatives that related to neurodiverse policies are great, but you can't always tell as that's a accurate way of speaking to people. ERGs are kind of like clubs or societies, kind of like almost like a union in a way. It's a support system. And a lot of the time you have them for like maybe a women's network or LGBT, or maybe like one for like minority groups or underrepresented. quite often there's a disability one. And more, there are becoming neurodiversity ERGs. Now, I am completely for them because they are people-led. They are created by individuals who are or resonate or allies, and they kind of speak up when there is less representation. If many ways, it's much more authentic because they're not doing it. Again, nothing against HR teams, but I think they have to be honest that it looks good for the company to have inclusive policies where ERGs is voluntary. The only reason they're doing it is because they care about it. I will say though, in my experience, ERGs are the most hardest ones to set up for neurodiversity. The kind of conclusion that I've made to why they are really difficult to set up and maintain is that all the other kind of groups I mentioned have a much more of a unifying glue. So, if you LGBT, like gender, you all have something inherently in common, a common experience, which kind of unites you. Where neurodivergent individuals, in our very nature, we are completely diverse. We have a wide ranging of opinions. So when it comes to agreeing to kind of formatting and kind of having something which everyone kind of gets behind, it is nearly impossible. So I've unfortunately seen many groups that have kind of fallen apart because someone who, say, has autism will say, this is the most neuro-inclusive perspective. And yet some with ADHD will be like, this goes completely against how I would prefer to do things. So that's why I think they are incredibly useful, but I do think they need a different approach to how other ERGs have been created.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think the thing that separates ERG groups from perhaps, I don't know, company organized training or whatever it might be, is that there's an element of sort of ground up, right? They're often sort of led by people within the business. It's not necessarily just like top down leadership decides go and set up an ERG group. Quite often there's an element of collaboration between colleagues and setting them up around that sort of passion points and things that are really important to people individually. And there can be some real positives to that. I think certainly the organizations I've seen really lean into neurodiversity at a director level, or essentially as high as possible, where I've seen directors open up about, their own diagnoses or their own experience with family and kids and stuff like that. I've often seen that have quite a positive impact, sort of, trickling down, I guess you could say. So there's an element of which the top-down approach is going to be important. There's an element to which the bottom-up approach is going to be important. And of course, every organization will be different. I'd be curious to know before we have to wrap up is if you were an and this is such a generic question, I apologize in advance because it's like how long is a piece of string, but if you were an organization that recognized you hadn't done anything on neurodiversity and needed to start, where would you start? How would you sort of invite them to consider this important and yet quite unboundaried topic?
Oh, I mean, it's a good question. The way I would go about it, if you are starting from absolute scratch, that's an advantage in many ways because you can shape it in the most kind of progressive, up-to-date way. I find organizations which are really old and deep-rooted really struggle to modernize. So rather than beat yourself up on the fact that you haven't done anything up until this point, see it as an opportunity. I would focus less on grouping people up because that again isn't how I see as the future in terms of how we should do it. So like, all right, neurodiverse that side, neurotypical that side. I would say that a neurodiversity initiative should be about embracing diversity of thought in terms of how we get the best out of people. And rather than seeing it as, all right, what do we do for dyslexic people, dyspraxic people, more see how do we do it for people. And I find that brings everyone along for the journey. Unfortunately, the key barrier I find to neuro-inclusion tends to be due to generational gaps, because generationally, there's the biggest divide in terms of how people see it. There's also the kind of race angle and culture angle where some people see it as positive, some people see it as negative, some people see it as neutral. So I would kind of lean into that have a discussion. How do people like to work? Simple questions like, does our team like working indoors, outdoors? Do they like writing down? Do they like hearing things? And when we are creating adjustments for people, what are adjustments that either benefit every single person or doesn't disadvantage anyone? Because I think when we start creating policies which start segregating people and benefit some and disengage others, then you're not really moving the conversation forward. The biggest rebuffals I've had towards neuro-inclusion is the classic, well, why did they get it and not me? This kind of this feeling of injustice. And I think, because we all have different ways of working and we all struggle and benefit in different ways, if you see someone who is struggling and gaining support, even though their needs may be a little bit higher than yours, it still kind of feels a bit unfair to you because ultimately we are kind of self-driven by our own motivations. So the type of kind of future I would see is that move beyond labels. I think while they, as I said, are beneficial in a medical setting, in a workplace, I think ideally they shouldn't even be needed. I think what's much more important is, do you know your employees? Like you said with Amanda Kirby, like, do you have a profile? Do you know what your skills are, what works well, what doesn't work well? Do you know not just individually how each team thinks, but do you know how the team thinks as a coherent unit? I often do this presentation where I get people to work out what their spiky profile is. So what are the things they find difficult and what are the things they find easy? And that is a good way of explaining what it means to be neurodivergent. But I like to take it a step further and say, well, if we all did this together, what is the average? And the average always tends to be quite level or circular. And I think that's the goal for me. It's not about purely acknowledging differences. It's acknowledging that the advantages difference can bring when we are all integrated with all different types of thinking. So yeah, a truly integrated workforce that doesn't see any particular way of thinking as right nor wrong, while still acknowledging the inherent challenges that certain mindsets may face, that ultimately everyone is of value, if that makes sense. Sorry, I blabbered a bit, but you get the gist.
No, I absolutely loved it. And I think the point you made there about the average being a straight line or sort of round, really powerful. And sort of a mic drop piece there towards the end. No, I loved it. And I mean, fantastic to hear your thoughts on it. I could talk to you all day about this. I've spent the whole sort of discussion bashing this article, so I'll give it a positive, but I did like right towards the end, sort of final couple of lines, it says, the payoff for companies will be considerable. Access to more of their employees' talents along with diverse perspectives that may help them compete more effectively. Innovation is most likely to come from parts of us that we don't always all share. And I like that, this idea, again, like you said, it all just comes down to diversity of thought. And if we all thought the same, life would be pretty dry, pretty boring. Look, Nat, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. I would just love to kick this around and see where it takes us for hours on end. Where can people find you? We'll put it all in the show notes and link to your TED Talk and all that. But where can people find you?
First of all, thanks so much, Frank. I really appreciate it. I mean, just for people listening, I just want to state that I appreciate these areas can sometimes be controversial or definitely kind of raise your blood pressure. And I think that just means that we're still growing and we're still developing. The views in the article that we spoke about, some of it still holds true. Some of it is still very, very outdated and isn't how we see things today. Equally so are some of the views that we've discussed in this conversation. I'm saying they're not right nor wrong, but having them can kind of lead us into a direction which hopefully is more inclusive. I would also like to just mention that I do think I've seen many organizations which like say, I only hire autistic people or I only hire these sort of people. While I think that can be great in the short term, in the long term, it is about having that diversity of thought. So hire people based on the organizational needs. Let's say you do this spiky profile and you notice there's like a gap in your team, which is more kind of analytical based. Maybe hire someone who has that skill set. And then you always try to keep that circle, not in terms of every single individual having a very well-rounded skill set, but as the entire team having an overwhelming, more well-rounded skill set. But anyway, in terms of how to find me, my name's Nat, or Nathaniel, so Nat Hawley, and you can find me at divergentthinking.uk. And yeah, if you ever want training for your team, if you want to reach out, have a discussion, I'm all ears. But honestly, really enjoyed having this conversation with you today.
Likewise, it's always nice to see people with such sort of shared interests and passions and doing well. So thank you so much for your time today. To our wonderful listeners, thank you. Where you can, stay curious, stay kind, see where these conversations take us. Let us know what you thought, whether you agree, disagree. Love to hear it. Nat, thank you so much. To our wonderful listeners, see you soon. Bye-bye.